If somebody says something to me that I don't want to focus on, I just go car dancing. And immediately that triggers my brain into focusing on what I want to do. I want to connect with the car. I want to think about how I'm turning the wheel, how I'm releasing the brakes, how I'm getting back to throttle, how I'm sensing the limits of the car. And that trigger kind of counteracts what other people are saying to me. So somebody can come up to me and say, don't crash the car. And it's almost like I let that go and I'm going to go car dancing.
Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 31. For this show, I'm delighted to welcome back Ross Bentley, one of my earliest guests from way back in episode 3. Ross is a former top-level Indycar driver who now works as one of the world's foremost driver coaches through his Speed Secrets brand. The topic for this show is about understanding and developing a performance state of mind for your track driving. As ever, with Ross, the show is packed full of practical, actionable, and simple tips and tricks you can try to help you drive faster. So as ever, grab a pen, grab a coffee, sit back, and let's hear what Ross has to say. So welcome back, Ross Bentley.
Hey, thanks for having me back. I thought you would have kicked me out by now. So
it's so great to have you back on the show. My first repeat guest, and it's a real pleasure to give you the feedback from before, which a show that was really well received. And I'm so excited. We said at the end of the show I'll come back, and I'm so pleased we've been able to arrange this, and it's great to have you back. So thank you again.
Thank you. And it's what I love is I see the stuff that you're putting out there on your website, and it's awesome material. And so anything I can contribute, I'm happy to. So I think, Samir, that I love helping drivers, and that's what I get a huge kick out of. And you're doing the same kind of thing. Hey, it's fun to have a conversation with you.
Wonderful. And that's a great point. So for today's topic, it's about improving drivers or improving yourself on the track. And I, as an engineer, come at it more from that analytical side. We touched on that before as well. Where if you remember, like I'm a bit over analytical in the car sometimes, and I've got to give myself a slap and use your phrase, drive stupid. But then you're coming at it, obviously there's an overlap, but you're also coming at it from the point of view of making it to the top as a driver. And then you've been able to coach others from very much human side of things. Yes, data's a tool to help you do it, but you could do it without it. So I thought that would be a great topic for today's conversation in terms of how do we navigate this pathway such that at the end of the day, we feel better as a driver than we did before. And there's some evidence of that, be it on the stopwatch or confidence or whatever. So how does that sound?
Sounds fantastic. And I love the overlap part of it. And I think some of the overlap, it's not just drivers too, right? Because I've worked with a lot of different engineers through my career, and I think engineers understanding what the driver is going through is just as important as, it's actually the other way around. I think not enough drivers understand what engineers do and how they're thinking as well. So the best combinations in the sport, I think, is when you look at the combinations of going way back, Jimmy Clark and Colin Chapman, and today it's Lewis Hamilton and Bono, and it's in different forms of the sport, there's these magic combinations of engineer and driver. And that's truly when the magic happens, when they're both on the same page and they're overlapping and complementing each other.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to see. So one of the things at an amateur level is that we don't always have that engineer.
It's either the same person.
It could be multiple people contributing little bits and pieces, or it could be you doing it on your own. And I'm the driver, and then I'm going to get out of the car, take my overalls off, put my mechanic's overalls on, start spannering. I'm going to fill the thing up with fuel so I can go again. I might go off and do some analysis of my driving and then come back. So you're everything. You've got that one extreme versus at the professional level where all these jobs are divided out. So it's interesting to think about how we can learn from the way the pros are doing it and try and bring that to some level of value back in an amateur environment where we don't necessarily have the time or that depth of experience.
That's a great point, because I think one of the challenges and sometimes a mistake that I see club racers, amateurs make is that break between they've gotten out of the car, they've taken their driving gear off, and they're now working on the car, and they're in engineering or mechanic mode. And then they try to switch back to driver mode, and the switch is not very successful. And being able to make that switch and get into the right, I call it performance state of mind, to perform at your best as a driver. Too many drivers are on the track still with the spanner in their mind or in their hand kind of thing. So they haven't made that switch. And that's a tricky thing. It's one of the things that I work with a lot of drivers, whether they're the whole team, a one-person team, or whether they have a lot of people around them. But it's making that switch from out of the car to in the car and now into that performance state of mind. And okay, Samir, if I tell you a quick little story.
I was hoping you were going to tell me this story. I was like, I want to hear more about this. How do you actually do that?
So years ago, as a coach, I've been coaching for decades now. But I was coaching a driver who was racing in the professional Formula Atlantic series in North America. And this driver was in his first season, not very experienced in racing, had jumped up into that class, maybe even a little bit earlier than he should have. We were at Road America, and Road America is a big track. It's 4.2 miles. There's a lot of corners. It's one of those tracks it's difficult to put a lap together. But when you put it together, it's an amazing place. And so before qualifying, and he had his best qualifying all season long up to that point was probably 15th. And before qualifying, we're sitting in the team transporter. And I remember he's in his driving suit. I'm staying there, and we're sitting up on the benches in there. He had played hockey in college, and he was a goalie. And I remember I said, "Tell me about your best hockey game ever." And it was just one of those killing time before qualifying. And he starts telling me about this game where before the game, he's stretching out and he just felt really good. And you get on the ice and they're warming up and he's moving well. And beginning of the game, and somebody comes down and he makes his big diving save and he saves it. And he just has the game of his life. And by this point, he's jumped off the bench and he's in his goalie stance, in his driving suit, telling me this story. He's totally animated. He's like, he is replaying that game entirely. And he's explaining, didn't get a goal scored on me. They carried me off the ice. I was like the star of the game. And I look at my watch and go, whoa, it's time for qualifying. He goes, gets in the car, gears up, puts his helmet on, gets belted in, goes out there. He put the car on the pole. As his coach, I was shocked.
As his coach, you went, what just happened?
Exactly. Like, did he just become more talented? No. Did he just gain a bunch of skills? No. But what happened was he accessed 100% of what he had. And I would make the argument that a lot of drivers don't access 100% all the time. They do the best. World champions do it 99% of the time. But most drivers access something less than 100% most times. And the closer you get to accessing every little ounce of talent you have in your body, the more successful you're going to be. And at that time, in that series, there were drivers coming up through the ranks, guys like Dan Weldon, Buddy Rice, who went on to win the Indy 500. There was like 5 or 6 other drivers that went on to race in Indycars and other places and sports cars and stuff like that. These were not bad drivers. But on that day, he went from 15th to 1st, and he put the car in the pole, where putting it all together was so important. And what I learned from that is, if you replay a past success just prior to going and performing, you're more likely to perform at your best.
Something you can force on yourself to do that. It's a bit like the analogy I've got for that. If you're feeling a bit down in the dumps and you force yourself to smile, you can't help but feel happier. Even actually, if you don't want to feel happier, you can't help it. Is that the same kind of thing?
Absolutely. And to me, it's all around having triggers. I'm big on having triggers. And another driver that I've worked with, a trigger that we've used, I remember asking him, tell me about your best race. And it was a karting race. And he had raced in South Bend, Indiana. So we used the phrase South Bend. And that became his trigger. Every time he gets in the car, he just goes, South Bend. And it triggers that replay of that performance. And in this case, with this driver at Road America, we took the name of the team that he was playing against at that hockey game, and that became his trigger each time he got in the car. And he didn't need me to tell him. Over time, it helped that every time he got in the car, I'd just go boom and say that, and that would trigger him replaying that for a few seconds or a few minutes, depending on how much time he had. Somebody listening to this, and they're the mechanic, engineer, transport driver, sponsor hunter, and driver. There comes a point in time where you put the helmet on and you go, and you say that phrase or that word. And the more time you do this, the more it becomes programmed in your mind. And now you've got, boom, now you're in that performance state of mind.
That's wonderful. One of the things that's worked quite well from my own experience is music. And it's not always sure like what the right music is, but it gives you an emotional response regardless of your taste in music. There is an emotional response you can have, and it can either build you up or calm you down or whatever. And I've often wondered how that fits into all of this as well, and gives you that sense of confidence. It just lifts you up, like you say, to that performance state where everything's just that little bit easier, you're just flowing. You're much more confident compared to, I missed that apex again, or break too early, or in that negative spiral that is so easy to fall into.
I think you touched on a couple of things there. The one is the emotional part of it. For me, my trigger to get into a performance state of mind is car dancing. And my first race in an Indycar was on a street course in my hometown where there was just a little bit of pressure to perform, and it was pouring rain the very first session. And I finished the first session in my first practice session in IndyCar weekend, and I was fifth quickest. And people were like, whoa. And they were like, what was that like? And I'm going 800 horsepower in IndyCar and a street course lined with concrete walls. It was like I was dancing with the car. And that kind of triggered this emotional thing for me of when I'm driving at the limit, I'm just like, I'm dancing with the car. We're moving together. We know where we're going together. And that triggers that state of mind for me. And your trigger word could be, I don't know, flowers or toaster. And if you did it enough, that would work. But it might not trigger the same emotional response. So I think you're right. Music sometimes, for some people, the right song just gets you into that mood, that state of mind. So there's that part of it. And then the other part you touched on there was confidence. And if it's worked in the past, you're more likely to know that it's going to work again. You know, this is no different than any great athlete. You watch tennis players at Wimbledon. Before a serve, they bounce, bounce, serve. There's a routine. And that routine becomes a part of the trigger, but it also becomes, that's the way I do it, and that's when I win. So it builds on itself as well. That's the fantastic thing, is the more you do this, the more it works, the better it works.
So my question is around the external influences. So if I bring in someone like myself, who's done a bit of, maybe I'm doing some coaching, but I'm coming at it from the point of view of the analytics and the numbers, and we've got some data here. And so it's a very objective, it's very dry information. It's like the numbers say you can brake a bit later, or the numbers say your heel and toe is not very good, or there's an opportunity in turn 3 because there's a better line you can take. And this kind of stuff is quite accurate in all things being equal. But then it's how you translate that into something that the driver can enact is the absolute art that I'd be fascinated about. I'd be fascinated to hear your opinion on that, about how you use these tools. Because, like I say this all the time, I don't want the fastest car on a laptop. I want the fastest car on the racetrack. And that involves the driver believing what you're saying and doing their best to put it out there and do it. So what's your experience of folding that side of things into this, what is quite an emotional, quite a psychological almost state of mind that you could pop it, couldn't you, if you just said the wrong thing about or overloaded the driver with too much information? You know,
first of all, I'm a big believer, user of data and video and all of the analytical tools because, well, there's objective measures and metrics, but there's also the subjective ones, and I could touch on those a little bit. You talked about the outside influences, and I will say that as a driver coach, in working with drivers at different levels, from amateur one-person club racers to pro racers in IMSA, Indycar, whatever. One of the things that I do at times is counteract what people around the driver are saying. The very, very first thing that, and I joke when I say this, is don't use don't. The driver's brain cannot hear the word don't. So if there was a time when I was working with a driver and the engineer just before qualifying walked up to him and said, don't crash the car because we don't have any spares. Guess what the driver did? He crashed the car. And I'm not saying that engineer necessarily made the driver crash, but rather than the driver focusing on what do I need to do to go fast and not crash the car, the focus was on don't crash the car. Do you think he was more relaxed or more tense? He was more tense. When you're more tense, do you feel the car more? No, you feel it less. So one of the things that I do as a coach a lot of times is I'm paying attention to what everybody says to a driver. And if I need to step in afterwards and then turn something around and put it into the what to do rather than what not to do approach, that's part of my job as a coach. Now, as a one-person driver team at the track, or your spouse is there or a friend is there and your friend comes up and says something to you and it's, don't think about that, don't think about that. We cannot think about things. So again, we need to have those triggers. And for me, again, welcome to use this, but if somebody says something to me that I don't want to focus on, I just go car dancing. And immediately that triggers my brain into focusing on what I want to do. I want to connect with the car. I want to think about how I'm turning the wheel, how I'm releasing the brakes, how I'm getting back to throttle, how I'm sensing the limits of the car. And that trigger kind of counteracts what other people are saying to me. So somebody can come up to me and say, don't crash the car. And it's almost like I let that go and I'm going to go car dancing. So that's a big part of it. And that shows up. I think it shows up in the data. I know, Samir, I know you can look at a data trace from a driver and you can see hesitation in the driver. You can see a lack of confidence in a driver just by looking at those squiggly lines. Now, you and I have been looking at squiggly lines for a long time, right? So we've been able to correlate. You get that driver that gets out of the car and their eyes are big and their breathing is sped up and they're like, wow, that driver was just a little bit intimidated, scared, whatever you want to call that, and probably lacking confidence based on what they're saying. And you look at the squiggly lines and you go, that's what that squiggly line means. And you get enough. For somebody that's relatively new to that, that's harder to see. But if a driver just simply asks themselves after a session, how did I feel? How did I feel that session? Sure, it's a more subjective thing. Maybe even on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident did I feel that session? That was a 6. Or that was a 9. On a scale of 1 to 10, how close did I feel like I was at the limit? Do I feel like I was really using the limits of the car? And if you ask yourself these questions and you write it down in your little track notes book or track map or something like that, you don't share it with anybody else. Those are your own personal little things. It's your own little journal kind of thing. Over time, you start to recognize trends. And I've had drivers who do that kind of thing. And what I recognized was every single time I got a good night's sleep, I drove better the next day. And every single time I had a bad sleep, I didn't drive as well. And I didn't really recognize that until I went through the process of writing those things down. And then it became obvious. What do you need to focus on? You don't need to focus on tire pressures or adjusting your dampers. You need to get a better night's sleep. Yeah. So I think both the objective and subjective metrics are super important.
I did a bit of work with a driver recently where it was another bit of data, but you might be interested. We put a heart rate monitor on him for the day.
Oh, yes.
And again, it's not something that I see that often. And we did it, and you could see it was a test day, and he did 4 sessions. And this guy's pretty fit, so his resting heart rate is quite low. And you didn't have to know when he went out. You just looked at his trace of his heart rate for the day, and you could see these peaks, right? And he peaked at 150 beats per minute, which is quite high. I thought we were both surprised. But the interesting thing was, and I don't know if you found this, is that, well, I certainly thought it was interesting, is that his heart rate didn't really come back down for the whole day. So it started off quite like 70, 80, something normal. Then he's done his first session, and then it's come back down, but it's not come back down 70, 80, it's sat at 90, 100. And that kind of crept up during the day. And then, so one of the things that I thought was quite interesting is like, so he's coming out of the car, but he's still energized. And I was thinking, because you get to the end of a day, a track day, and you're exhausted. And it's like, what have I done? I've only sat in the car for 20 minutes 4 times. I shouldn't be this tired. And part of my thinking was maybe that's because you're wound up all day. And then the other thing we all tend to do is we get out of the car and wander around. No one ever sits down. So it's just like, because you're off seeing people and you're walking off and going off to all these different places. And I just thought that was really interesting data in the sense of, well, now I'm a bit more aware. I can manage that. I can force myself to sit down. I can have something to eat or a drink that will help manage my fluids. I'm just more aware of the fact that I'm a bit more wound up here. And one of the things you just said a minute ago is that tension reduces your feel. So I've not heard that before, but it seems like as soon as you said it, that seems to make sense. So what have you done in that?
Go drive on the road and hold the steering wheel really tight. Like just grip the wheel super tight and notice what vibration you feel back through the wheel from the road. And then relax your hands and arms and your shoulders and just relax yourself. And then notice how much feel you get back through the steering wheel doing that. And it proves that a more relaxed feel is going to give you better sensing of the limits of the car. So absolutely, that's part of it. And I love the heart rate thing. And I've been doing a lot of work with that in the past few years, actually, but just quite recently as well. And you touch on 2 things there, I think. And certainly there's a physical part of your heart rate. We work harder, and there's no doubt we're working hard in a race car. And you're working harder, so physically your heart rate goes up. But there's also the adrenaline part, and it's more than just adrenaline, but there's the mental part of it and the stress that comes from it. And that certainly contributes to the heart rate not falling back down to where it was at the beginning of the day, unless you practice some, we don't want to get into the whole Zen woo-woo meditation kind of thing. But certainly, as you say, sitting down, relaxing, practicing some breathing to get your body more relaxed again, you're going to be more receptive to the learning. You get out of the car and you've learned something. If you take 5 minutes, close your eyes and just relax, not even really thinking about what you did, but just relax. There's research that shows that your brain will process and consolidate what you've learned on the track much more than it will if you are walking around and doing all sorts of other things. 5 minutes. That's all it takes. 5 minutes will make a big difference there. And as you talked about heart rate, I worked with a driver in driving an LMP2 car, sports car in IMSA. We were testing, and we had a heart rate monitor and using telemetry, so I could see it live. So as he's driving around the track, I could see, and it's interesting because there are certain corners you'd see a little bit more of a spike because they were either higher G loads or more intimidating corners. And again, there's some combination of both the fear element, but also the higher G loads, your body is working harder. But it got to the point where I'd be sitting in the timing stand and I'd nudge the engineer sitting next to me and going, this is going to be a good lap. And it was. And what it was, I could see his heart rate was in the right window. If the heart rate got too high, the lap times dropped. They got slower. If the heart rate was too low, the lap times were slower. And it was this combination, I think, of you have to push. Like if you're too relaxed out there, you're not going to get a quick lap time. But if you're pushing and trying too hard and the heart rate gets too high, then you're going to be slow as well. And there's that ideal window. I know not everybody's got access to heart rate monitors and telemetry and things, but it just points out that, again, a heart rate monitor is not that difficult to wear and use these days. And if you just start to monitor that each time you drive and you start to correlate it to, I drove really well that session. What was my heart rate? Oh, it was in that zone most of the time. And so then you can start to think about, how, as you said, how do you manage that? And it's another super important metric that, we tend to look at tire pressures and ride heights and all these other things around the car. But what about the internals of the driver? It's critical.
Having done a little bit of work in sport, heart rate is something that's fairly commonly measured. Interestingly, The physiologists I work with had, heart rate, they're just, it's too slow for them. It's not accurate enough. It's not precise enough compared to what they're used to, what they need, blood lactate and oxygen levels. That's where they head to. So there's always another level of data you can go to. But there's two things there. I do like the idea of the zone, because that's something that's quite common in aerobic type activity, where you have these zones, 1 to 4, and I'm going to do my training in these different zones, and for very specific reasons, because you're either pushing your VO2 max or you're trying to build a base to be able to do that, and some elasticity in your body. You need to spend time in these zones, all of them, so that you're overall more fit, particularly if you're into some of the more long distance stuff. And so I wonder whether there's a thing for drivers that we've just invented on this show, which is basically, right, maybe there's high, low and target. And when you're doing your workout in the gym, that is the target you want to be at, which isn't going to be 90 beats per minute. It's, like you say, it's going to be a little bit more closer to your aerobic kind of threshold, as it were, but not too far so you're just fatigued straight away.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the other things there is what the right zone is for you may not be the right zone for me. And as a great example of this is just finished doing some heart rate stuff in our team racing in IMSA in an LMP2 car, where we have a gentleman driver in his 50s and we have a young pro driver, 25-year-old.
Yeah.
And the different zones, it's quite dramatic.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing to me is the older driver is his heart rate in the car is much lower than the pro.
Yeah.
You would, in some ways, you might think for a gentleman driver who hasn't been driving race cars all his life, the stress level would be way up and everything, but he's quite calm and relaxed in the car and his heart rate's quite low in relative to this 25-year-old pro. And yeah, the pro is a little faster, but it's not dramatic as well. So it's just, it points out that you can't just say, hey, all drivers, your heart rate should be between 140 and 145 beats per minute, and then you'll be driving in the zone. No, you've got to find out what is. So again, if you do that, a little journaling, note-taking afterwards, and you go, I just felt fantastic in the car that session. And you look and you go, oh, my heart rate was between whatever, 135 and 145. And man, that session, I was terrible. And your heart rate was at 160. Okay, there's something there, or 120. So you start to find out what is right for you. And then I like what you're talking about is then go and train in that zone. Try to spend more time there. So you even, maybe over time, you start to recognize this is my zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're talking about there is no different than just going to do your tire pressures, is it? Because at the end of the day, we're just trying to optimize what we have around us. We're not going to re-engineer the tire. We don't really know and may not even care why one pressure is more appropriate than another. All we know is that I've just had a good session and those tire pressures, they're the ones I want next time.
Exactly. And I have tested with the exact same car with two drivers, and one driver likes tire pressures that are 2 PSI less than another driver. And maybe the tire generated a little bit more grip, but it wasn't quite as responsive on turn-in. The other driver liked that responsiveness of a stiffer tire, but it may not have quite the same level of grip. So there's differences there as well. Hey, if this was one setup, all this for everybody, it'd be simple and we'd all get bored and go play some other sport.
Much cleverer people than I will have solved this problem many, many years ago. It's not new. One of the things on the heart rate, just to amuse you, was that with this guy, so he did his 4 sessions and there were 4 peaks, but after the second one there was another little peak, so the peak came down and then it flipped back up again. We joked because that was when I was giving him his feedback. Going, how fast?
And maybe some of it was you're explaining to him, so he's starting to play what he needed to do in his mind, and we know all you need to do is sit at home, monitor your heart rate, close your eyes, drive a couple laps in your mind, and do a heart rate then, and your heart rate's gone up, and you haven't physically done anything, but you're mentally at that point. So maybe the feedback was just getting him to replay what he needed to do, which is fantastic if you can give the feedback that way. And the driver can put himself into that situation.
So I love your approach, to be honest, because immediately I was thinking I was bad at giving him feedback. Because my natural disposition is to think it's gone bad again. And yours is, oh no, that's probably quite good because he's back in the mood. Okay. Yeah, there is just two different things. I thought I'm getting him all wound up.
You bring up a really good point around certainly my coaching approach is a lot of times I will focus on a driver's strengths. Most drivers, they get out of the car and they go, oh, that sucked. I need to do that better. I need to do that better. I need to do that better. And a lot of times what I'll do is say, what did you do? What did you do right?
The thing is, it's so natural for you. I would think to do that. But I'd have to be really forcing myself to do it. And I think if you're doing it for yourself as well, it's how do you let go of that turn 3 that you've mucked up 4 times in a row and you can do it better. And all the rest of the lap's brilliant. And that's a bit, you're saying what went well.
And I don't think you necessarily even have to let it go, but you just have to add it. And I'm a great believer in making some notes after a session. And if at the top of the page, you've written, what did I do that session? And you just ask yourself that every single time. And a lot of drivers will just gloss over it and move on. Yeah. But no, you go, no, what did I do? I braked really well going into turn 1. And you write that down. And you force yourself to go through that debrief process with yourself. And you're self-coaching when you're doing this. And you go through that process and you find out that there's a lot of things you're doing right. And if you go back and focus on doing more of those right things, sometimes you don't have time to do the wrong thing. And when you do more of the right things, sometimes those right things start to transfer over to the turn 3 that you mucked up. So sometimes you fix things by just doing more of what was working before. And you're right. It's human nature. And maybe it's even more than human or different than human nature. It's our culture. Yeah. Our culture is you need to do better here, you need to do better here, you need to do better here.
Perfectionism. We're striving for that perfect lap. That know, and I can talk to. I'm sure you're the same. Any top level driver, Formula One, Indycar, whatever. All of them. When I've spoken to on the show or whatever, they all. Yeah, I might have done one in my career. I've been doing it for 20 years, 30 years.
And that's a great mindset to have. Like you're always looking for more. I'm all about that, but it's how you do it. And I think what I have seen of top level drivers is they don't waste a lot of time beating themselves up. Sure, they want to improve and they recognize where they want to improve, but I've seen drivers that just beat themselves up.
I think that's really common. So why is that? Is it, and I'm just speaking aloud, is that because the hobby takes so much commitment, time away from family? It's a big commitment to go out on track. Even if you're just doing track days or racing or whatever at an amateur level, it's still a big investment at some level. And there's maybe expectation that's built up around that, or pride, or what is it that, why do you think people get so down on themselves about it?
I think you touched on certainly some of them. The other thing that something that I always say is you do what you do because you're programmed to do. And sometimes you don't do what you want because you haven't been programmed or you don't have the right programming to do that. And so some of it is, again, it's how do we get the mental programming that we have? Some of it's just the environment that we've grown up in. I've read studies around twins, identical twins, who were separated and brought up in different families. And there are certain parts of their characteristics, their personality, their behavioral traits. Some of them are very alike 20 years later, but some of them are very different. And some of it is the DNA, that they're just how they're wired. And then some of it is what they're grown up in. And if you think about far extremes, a child that's grown up in a very abusive household versus one that's been grown up in a very positive household, they're going to have different programming. Now, hopefully in our world, it's not that extreme, but often I'll ask a driver, what did you do that session? And they'll go, I was terrible on the brakes in the turn 1, and I missed the apex in turn 3, and I've screwed this up in that corner. And I go, no, I didn't ask you what you did wrong. I said, what did you do? And their programming stops them from even going there. And I've got to really almost force myself through and keep asking that question. And eventually I go, okay, I did this. Okay, I did this. So in that case, I think a lot of that is just, it's their programming. They were programmed always to look at, what did you do wrong? What could you do better? And do we as parents program our kids? Yes, we do, for better or worse. And some of that applies to when they get in a car. I was coaching a young driver. He was 14 or 15, coming from karts, moving into open wheel cars. And we were in a conversation one day around patience. And racing is not all about, we're not the most patient people in the world, but there comes a time and a place where you've got to be a little patient with getting back to power or whatever, right? Or in a racing situation. And I remember saying to him, you just need to be more patient in this area. And he goes, oh, I can't be patient. I go, what? Why not? And he says, I'm just not patient. I'm not patient. I go, what do you mean? He says, my parents tell me all the time, I'm not patient. I'm impatient. Is it a case of this kid was not patient, or was it a case of his programming said he wasn't patient and therefore he acted in an impatient way? So if you think about it from how we're programmed and the mental programming we have in our head, it then just becomes, well, okay, how do we build the right programming?
Yeah, there's a guy I've done a bit of coaching with, and he changes gear. This thing's like with the most aggression you've ever seen. And I'm not, to be honest, I'm at a loss of how to bring this up because it's not making him any quicker. And it's certainly increasing the chances that he's going to break something. But it's that management of the mind of that's what I need to do because I'm a racing driver.
Well, I think there are a lot of drivers who believe that to be a fast race driver, you've got to be pounding the shifts and turning the wheel a bunch. And so I think part of that is starting to change that driver's programming and their mental model of what a great driver does.
So he's not slow. And I think that's actually part of the challenge that I've got, is that this guy's put it on pole before in a very competitive one-make series, but he's not getting the results. He's not getting the podiums. He's finishing top 4, 5, 6, but he's not making that next step. And I wonder whether some of it's to do with just this refinement of actions, but also mentally, what it takes to drive quickly in a race or, at all.
Yeah, it's again, people have a mental model of race drivers being fast and their hands flailing around and all that kind of stuff. And we watch Formula One drivers. We watch Lewis Hamilton drive. And unfortunately, he doesn't have to move the shifter. So we can't see how calmly he would do that. I'm not saying he's going to be slow, but he's going to be he would be shifting calmly and precise as opposed to pounding it into gear. We don't have that. So it's difficult for him to maybe get the mental model, but go back and watch some video of Jackie Stewart driving years ago and just watch how fast was he, and try to start to change his programming around that. And you bring up a really good point of sometimes a little success gets in the way of a lot of success. And I've seen a graph of Tiger Woods when Tiger Woods was at the peak of his game. And it showed, I forget what year it was, where he won all these tournaments. And then at the peak there, he decided to change his swing. And the following year, he won fewer tournaments. But the year after that, he won more tournaments than he did the first year at his peak, because he changed. He wasn't afraid to make that change. And then at the peak of that, he changed his swing again. And the following year, he won fewer tournaments. So at the peak, the best, certainly one of the all-time greats, but at that time, nobody better. He was not afraid to make a change in a change in a fundamental skill that he uses. And each time he made a change, the following year, he won even more tournaments. And I think that just goes to show what the very, very best drivers are willing to do. They're not afraid to make a big change.
They need to feel safe to do that, mentally safe, in the sense of you need to have some support around you. And I think that's where someone like yourself, coaching or whatever, that is your job really, in the sense of just trying to build up the confidence and build up the technique, and give them the confidence to try and something new that will be slower to start with. I remember the first time I did heel and toe, for example, I was way slower, ridiculously. And but now I don't even think about it, and I'm much quicker as a result. But yeah, it takes that confidence and support and belief that this is actually going to be better. And
you nailed it there. It's confidence, it's support, it's ultimately the belief that this taking one step back to get 2 or 3 steps forward is doable. And I was going to say necessary, but I guess some of that comes back to, why is somebody doing this? If you're Lewis Hamilton, maybe not Lewis so much, but if you're Valtteri Bottas, your job's on the line. Or in the case of Daniel Ricciardo moving into McLaren, and he's got to change. He's got to make changes to his driving, and he's making some progress. But there's a guy who you have to have the confidence that I'm going to make these changes and they're going to pay off. Again, when your job's on the line, there's some motivation. If, hey, I go to the track and I race for fun, you and I, have to recognize that not everybody wants to make those changes.
So how do you measure progress? Final point for you, because I know you need to go off. How do you measure progress as a driver? Because it's not all about the stopwatch as a result, because we've just said you make some changes today in the hope of being faster, but possibly, like I'm answering my own question, but faster, but also more consistent and safer and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff in the future. But how would you help people measure progress?
So I think we touched on this earlier around there are objective metrics, and certainly lap times and results are one of them. And I think we can take some of those objective metrics that we have more access to. Like one of the things that I do with a driver that I'm coaching over the course of a season is I take the average of the lap times during a race, and I take that average and I compare that average against select other drivers. And it may be that at the beginning of the season, the average lap time is, let's say it's 2% slower than the other drivers. And by the end of the season, we got to within 0.7%. Well, we've made some good progress there. The fastest lap time may not have changed a whole lot. Now, I also look at that as well. It's just, so the more metrics I have, that's one of the things I use. We touched on heart rate. And if we can see that the heart rate zone is the driver spends more time in that ideal heart rate zone, that's another one. I look at heart rate sometimes as how hard the driver is working to get the lap time. And if they get a lap time, but the heart rate is spiked to do it, so that's probably not sustainable. It's not something you can be consistent with. So there is that. I personally like to use a system. I've developed a spreadsheet with a number of different characteristics from your racecraft. On a scale of 1 to 10, rate your racecraft that session. And I have the driver rate it, and I have my observation rating as well. Yeah. And if we both rate it at a 7 or a 9 or a 6 or whatever it is, we're both in alignment. If the driver rates it at a 9, I rate it at a 6, then we have a conversation about that. Yeah. And the more those subjective ratings start to go rise over the course of a season. And yes, I've had drivers where we have so many 9.5s that I say, okay, we're going to recalibrate the scale, and 9.5s are now 7s. And now we're working in a finer little area up there. So I think that's a valuable thing. I think that if a driver makes notes after an event and just says, I performed well in these sessions, this is how I felt, and just making some notes, if you go back at the end of a season and you read those, you will naturally see progression as well.
So interestingly, I've actually created several of these types of tools in Olympic sports, athlete profiles. And one of the things, I was working with one coach, and I forget the exact model now, but there's tactics and skill, physicality, all this sort of stuff. I forget, there's like 4 or 5 of a model. And then this coach added project management to it.
Yeah.
So you're saying make some notes, but if you're not making notes, that becomes part of your profile in the sense of like you're 0 out of 10 now. Make some notes, and so even the act of making notes is going to show your progression, because now we've got more information, even if they're subjective for the future. It's all positive. So the act of making notes levels you up as well.
I totally agree with that. And I use pre-event preparation and post-event. Yeah. And if the driver has filled out the report that the engineer wanted on the car's handling and did an analysis of their driving and then sat down and went through data and video and everything, that was going to be a higher rating. And again, it's different for every driver and where they're at. But you're right. The job, and I say that in air quotes here, because it's not always a job, but the job of a race driver is not just from the green flag to the checker flag. It's all the other stuff. In fact, if you look at how much time you spend away from the green and checker flag part of it, you spend more time outside of that. And what you do in those times are going to have a bigger influence on what happens between the green and checker flag than just about anything else.
I absolutely agree. On that note, I'm going to say thank you so much again for coming on. A slightly different show this time, and it's been a real pleasure. And honestly, I hope everyone's got a massive amount of stuff. I've got a page full of notes, so I'm moved up on my own note keeping, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. As you can tell, I've enjoyed this. So anytime I can share with drivers and everything, I love it. So thank you for letting me play with you here.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, bye for now.
Thanks.
What an absolute privilege to have Ross back on the show. He's so generous with his advice and genuine about helping you to lap faster and develop as a driver. I learn so much every time I talk with him, and I hope you've had several aha or I might try that too moments during this show too. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.